I'm Bryce Futch,
I'm Spencer Amaral.
and this is The Way Forward. Welcome back to the final episode of Season 2, The Way Forward podcast. Today we are coming live from the Futch home front porch. So it's going to be a beautiful afternoon. We have overcast skies. It's slightly cool in the beginning of summer. You might hear some road noise and some kids, but we think that is a wonderful trade-off for us to be able to sit here and smoke some cigars. Because as much as my wife loves me, that is not happening inside anytime soon. So Spencer, let's kind of wrap up everything today. So we've talked about the institution of family, we've talked about the institution of the church, and we've talked about the institution of government. And we've said that those are the three entities that God created and instituted for the welfare and well-being of man. We've talked about each of them individually, and in that conversation, we've talked a little bit about how they kind of interact with each other. But let's take today to kind of bring it all together and talk about how that right relationship should work and look between those three individual groups. So, since you are the reverend of the two of us, the more holy of the two,
I don't know.
I'm willing to wager. Let's let you start and talk about kind of the role of the church in fostering and encouraging family and holding government accountable and kind of what those two things look like.
The role of the church or the role of the family?
The role of the church in fostering family.
Fostering family,
Yeah.
and then how do you connect it to government?
How the church holds government accountable.
Church, yes. Okay. Yeah, so actually I really liked how you framed it that way, because that kind of puts the church in this hinge position, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where on the one hand it's looking to the world, it's looking to the people, and then it swings the other direction. It looks up at the state, it looks at the powers that be in society.
Right.
And it tries to present itself as a light to the world in both directions, right?
Mm-hmm.
On the state side, it's a little more of a conscience to the state, I think as Calvin would say.
Mm-hmm.
To the people, it's very much a shepherd's presence for the flock. There's a guiding role in that. There's a protecting role in that as well. The best way in which the church can influence the family, I think, is by providing it a fundamental level with a reason for being.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that's something that is becoming more apparent in our time. Probably a couple generations back, people would think that something like the family is just, it's self-evident, it's natural. This is what human beings naturally do. They fall in love, they make babies, they spend the rest of their days caring for those babies and watching their grandkids grow up,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And it would seem very self-evident and natural, and it is to a certain extent, but at the same time, the capacity of the human heart to go astray knows no bounds.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're rethinking everything right now,
Yeah.
and it's just a sign that you've taken away the foundation. You rip the
Yeah.
rug out from everything,
Mm-hmm.
and you remove its purpose for being in the form that it's in. And you remove this basic idea that, well, it looks like this for a reason.
Right.
Because this bears the fingerprints of God.
Mm-hmm.
He designed it. He shaped it this way because this is glorifying to Him and it's good for us.
Yes. And I think that's a part that the world just totally shuns, right? Is the idea that it's good for us. It's for our good, for our benefit. It's not rules for rules' sake and to
Right.
be domineering and belittling and persecutory. It's for your flourishing, right? That like when man functions in the form in which God created and pursuing those purposes in that right view of the world, society benefits, right? Everybody becomes better. I'm pretty sure we mentioned this early on, but Tom Holland, not the actor, but the noted anthropologist, credits Christianity with women's rights, right? Before Christianity came along, there was no such thing as women's rights. And that's from a guy who is not a believer, is an avowed non-Christian.
It is for our good.
Absolutely.
And the church should be leading the way in demonstrating that and persuading people of the truth of that.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, what's another way of saying that? It's like you got to remind people that you might think you're happier to just stay on the couch all day,
Mm-hmm.
but actually learning a little bit of discipline, learning a little bit of delayed gratification,
Yes.
gaining a hard work ethic, learning what it is to make sacrifices in
Mm-hmm.
the here and now for a worthy goal
Right.
is totally worth it. And it makes your life so much more meaningful and enjoyable.
Right.
Versus, rejecting discipline, sacrifice, delayed gratification out of hand because it's not fun, it's not pleasant.
Right.
And especially if it feels like these things are being forced on me.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a big problem with American society today. Well, we'll say society as a whole, but specifically American society. We've given up the idea that our freedom is the ability to do what we ought. For our freedom is the ability to do what we want, right? Lewis, and I'm sure we've mentioned this before too, abolition of man, right? Head is your reason, stomach is your passions, chest is your moral virtue. And if we remove that moral virtue, then our chief end becomes to use our reason to get what we want. And that's just a totally debased view of life and society.
We live in a time when capitalism and consumerism have so formed us and spoken to materialistic impulses that, I think what you just said would be considered heretical in a lot of
absolutely.
Mainstream circles.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
For sure.
How dare you try to impose pain and suffering on me?
Right.
Who are you to come along and tell me how to live my life, that there's a right way or a wrong way to do this, right? Or to force me even to do what you think is right.
Yeah.
There's so many things that have gone sideways for people to even have that reaction. Because at the end of the day, what is it that you're calling people to do? Mm-hmm. You're calling people to aspire to that which is true and good and beautiful and be more fully human and more fully alive. Yep. You're not trying to impose death and suffering on anyone.
Absolutely. And it's a misunderstanding too of the Protestant work ethic that you mentioned a minute ago, right? You take anybody today that's not a Christian that is a high performer, high achiever, and if you were to interview them, I feel confident that the majority of them would say that their desire to strive, to seek, to find, to not to yield is, they would say, well, that's incompatible with Christianity. It's incompatible with the good, the true, the beautiful, right? It's not a monastic view of life. Rather, it's hey, when you do these things, do them for the glory of God. Work harder than your coworker because it's what God has given you the ability to do, right? It's how are you working in relationship to the gifts and talents and abilities that God has given you. It's not a passivity of, go sit on your porch all day like we're doing and just talk ideas. It's get out there, do it, achieve, but for the right reason, for the right ends, not to bring glory to yourself, but to bring glory to the Lord.
Amen. And I think the other half of this, where the church has probably failed to provide a balanced and persuasive and accurate portrayal of the faith to the world around us, is the way in which we present the gospel today, and the way in which we portray the way of righteousness, the way we portray God's law. Yeah. There are a lot of versions of gospel presentations that make it sound like God's law is the curse. Yes. It is the problem. Right. And the power of the gospel, the beauty of the gospel, is to get away from that.
Free from the law,
ugly, cursed, brutal law. And, the psalmist is clear. Lord, your law is beautiful. I love your law. Continue to give me a heart that loves you and loves your law and can walk in your righteousness. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, come to me. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Right. And we all know at a certain level, Christ is calling us out of the world because we long for something that's better than this. Right. We see the brokenness all around us, and there's a piece of our soul. Anybody can look around and realize it was not meant to be quite like this. Right. There's a better way.
Absolutely. I think this, not to dive too deep into the theology weeds, but this is the difference between free grace and cheap grace, right? Free grace is it's free to you, but it will cost you everything, right? There's nothing you can do to earn it, but it will cost you everything. It costs you your life.
Requires a death to self.
Right. And that's the other part of that too is, society says, well, I don't want to die to myself. Well, you're either going to die to your sin or you're going to die to Christ, right? You're going to lose your life to one or the other. There's no way in which there's no other option, right? You will lose your life to something. The question is, will you lose it to your sin and to your depravity?
Everyone's going to worship something. Yep. What are you going to worship? Everyone's going to serve something. Yep. What are you going to serve? Everyone's going to make sacrifices. Yep. what are you going to sacrifice? Everyone's going to suffer.
Yeah.
In this fallen, broken, dying world. Everyone's going to face suffering. In fact, most of the time, we're all dealing with suffering.
Yep.
But we do get a choice in where we serve, where we suffer, and where we sacrifice. Because, Peter, Paul address these themes a lot in the epistles because they're dealing with, Christians in the early church who are constantly dealing with suffering and persecution. And they tell them, look, Peter especially in his epistles, he tells them, you're going to suffer. Obviously, those who suffer because they did wrong and, they kind of had this coming, there's not a whole lot of glory or meaning in that kind of suffering, right?
Yeah.
But for those who choose, instead of seeking their own selfish interests, seek to serve the kingdom of God, walk in the paths of light and righteousness, and love the people around them, and glorify God, and be Christ to the world in whatever way they can, that's not going to be a bed of roses either.
Right.
You're going to get a lot of pushback from a dark world that rejects the light. But that suffering that comes from suffering for the sake of Christ and his gospel is inherently meaningful.
Yep.
And we trust that it is vindicated on the other side by a God that knows all, sees all, judges all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to go back to the comment you made earlier, talking about the church being the conscience of government.
Yeah.
I think we think that our method of church is the best because it is, but at the same time, cultural Christianity, cultural morality is good for society, right? If we look at our education system and how broken it is, 100 years ago, a senator or a president or a governor or a small town mayor could make a speech and in it intone Christian values, Christian virtues, Christian biblical stories, and people would understand what they were talking about, right? They would understand the value of it. They would understand the protagonist in it. And now there's none of that, right? Nobody knows who Job is. Nobody understands any of these common threads that we have as a society. So maybe talk for a little bit about how the church can kind of reclaim some of that. Do you see a path forward on that other than simply increasing church attendance?
The early church has so much to teach us in this. So I'm a huge history buff, nerd. I love history. One of the most practical parts of studying history is it humbles you because you realize that there are people in the past who are way smarter than we'll ever be. But I'm grateful that we have a record of them and their lives and their struggles and their wisdom. It's not only humbling, though, it's also so practical because you recognize that we are not the first people to wrestle with these questions or encounter these problems. And in fact, those who came before us dealt with a lot worse. So I think of Justin Martyr right off the bat because he's an apologist for the church at a time when it's still, dealing with persecution in the Roman Empire. And what is his rebuttal to the accusations of Rome? And of course, every time a Christian is thrown into the lion's pit, killed in the arena, what is the charge? It's always a charge of treason because you've refused to bend the knee to the cult of the emperor. Right. You refuse to throw the incense, the pinch of incense to the shrine of Caesar. Because you're saying, no, Christ is king, Christ is Lord, Caesar is not God. Caesar is he's a man. He's not God. So for the Christians, this is a matter of faith to get this straight. They don't bend the knee to Caesar. So to the Romans, you're a bad citizen. You're a traitor. You're probably in the midst of trying to overthrow the state, right? And Justin Martyr comes along and says, whoa, we're actually your best citizens if you don't realize it. We're the ones who seek to walk justly, to love our neighbor, to care for the poor around us, rather than throw that responsibility on the state and the taxpayers.
Absolutely.
We look out for our own. We don't come crying to the state. We don't try to engage in corrupt schemes, in the polity. We're actually your best subjects. And the real clincher is because Christ's kingdom is not of this world, we're the last people that you have to worry about trying to stage an insurrection.
Yes.
We're not interested in your crown. We're interested in the crown that is in heaven, that we're actively serving and building his kingdom, but it's not at the point of the sword. Yeah. We're not trying to build a caliphate. That's not our Great Commission. So Justin Martyr just laying out the faith accurately, but with an eye to proving that you actually want more Christians in your society, believe it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a pretty persuasive case, actually. And I think a big part of the radical sweep between the church being persecuted for a few centuries to Rome becoming a Christian empire and the church overtaking the empire. Praise
really
God.
Good. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's great because there's so many, like you talked about, there's so many themes from then that are again current and timely, right? So right now Christians are not on the chopping block to get thrown into a lion's pit, but they are on the chopping block to get fired from their job. They are on the chopping block to get canceled from whatever culture they're in. This recently this whole thing with the kicker from the I don't know. I'm not I'm not an NFL guy, from the Chiefs.
Harrison Butker.
Yeah. So he's speaking at a Catholic university to a Catholic audience. He's a dedicated Catholic himself, and he's espousing these traditional Christian views, understandings, morals. And
it was like as apple pie white bread as you could get.
Right.
In large part, like what I heard. I guess I shouldn't be surprised that the world would react vehemently, but it's a good sign of how far the culture's moved away.
Absolutely.
Which is why, you say we're not going to get thrown in the lion's pit tomorrow. I sure hope not.
Yeah. And it might be 5 years from now, but
well, there's a very real crossroads that we're living at, and the world is not moving in our direction, and we're not even remaining stable. Like the world is actively moving away from us. And it's because they're not convinced that Christians are actually good citizens and good neighbors. Right. Back in the 80s, that was a given. Today, Aaron Renn talks about we moved from the negative world or from the positive world to a neutral world. Now we're in the negative world. And that's a range. It can grow more negative.
Sure.
So the more that the culture and just the window, the Overton window that we're in of our time, the more negatively it looks upon the church, the hotter the water will be that we live in.
Absolutely. And John Stonestreet's been, from Colson Center, he's been raising the red flag on this for quite a while. Talking about the Christians need an idea of they need a worldview of getting fired, right? Of what will I lose my job over? Where is my red line individually? And I think that's right on. I think it's something everybody needs to be mindful of. And part of it is because society, specifically now with all of these sexual issues, has just it's the absolute culmination of the sexual revolution, right? Of everybody is here to seek their own happiness, their own goodness, their own fulfillment. And if you have no other worldview for where fulfillment comes from, it's turned to sex, right? And
it's literally the fulfillment of the flesh,
correct,
rather than the soul,
right? And because of that, you're not supposed. I was told recently that polite society is a cliche, and I'm behind on my times and my cliches, but polite society as a whole right now is, if you're involved in a local group like the Rotary Club, right, the people that you're involved with are going to want to push these things because they want people to become a better version of themselves. They want people to be fulfilled, which are in and of themselves are good ideas, good desires. They're right ideas, right desires. The way they flesh them out, though, is wrong, right? Is a fallen nature. It's a poor substitute for the real thing. And so when you push back on this, they're going to say, well, you don't care about people. You don't want people to be fulfilled. You don't want people to find meaning. You don't want people to be happy. You don't want people to be satisfied. When is the exact opposite, right? Like, I want all of those things for these people, but I know that the direction they're going is an utterly bankrupt one, right?
Yeah, it seems like they have all of this comes back to anthropology too.
Right.
What is a human being? And what I hear a lot in what you're describing, it seems to me like a fixed view of people. Like, people just are this way, right? If you have a certain kind of wiring in your brain, nothing that you can do about it.
Yeah.
Right? And for you to get in the way of people acting on their specific, unique wiring is just an inherently evil thing to do.
Yeah.
I understand that narrative, like, given that view of human beings.
Right.
But you know what's missing in that account of people and the world around us? Any concept of good and evil, really.
Right.
Other than you trying to, get in the way of people.
Right. It's because we think that
instincts.
people are basically good, right, when they're not. And
well, it's
a poor starting point.
It's kind of a baked-in assumption.
It is.
And yet, I think that's one of the flimsiest ideas you
Oh,
could
yeah.
possibly throw out there in any debate. No one lives as though the people around them are good. We all lock our doors at
Right.
night.
Yep.
We all know the world is broken and fallen, and
Mhm.
sometimes, it's directly due to the malice of others or things outside of our control. Like, there's so many different ways
Right.
that we encounter evil and suffering in the world. Sometimes it's just due to carelessness, but regardless, you can't face a world that is filled with suffering and tell me people are basically and automatically good. In fact, they're not even just, basically morally neutral, but
Right.
people actively seek the good for themselves and others, and that's their default. Well, I think that there is that impulse in people because the law is carved into our hearts in a
Yes,
certain way.
absolutely.
We know better. We have a conscience.
Mm-hmm.
The grace of God is moving in and around us all the time. But that makes it all the more puzzling to read history books and see the staggering tragedies and atrocities that occur on every page of the history books.
Throughout time.
These are not anomalies. This is kind of the norm.
It's a status quo. Absolutely.
So if you're not ready to grapple with that fact. Anyway, so what are people? I think we're very complex creatures. We're constantly battling between vice and virtue.
Right.
And all that you're trying to put out there is this, crazy idea
Yeah.
that maybe people are better served by seeking virtue over vice, and virtue is actually better aligned with their long-term fulfillment and happiness more than vices. And so when we, even if I do have certain preclusions and a certain wiring, right? I'm really drawn to this thing. Well, if that thing is inherently vicious to my soul,
Right. And to your body.
and to my body, and to the society around me, to my family, how can I possibly justify this? It's going to take a lot of mental gymnastics, and we spend a lot of time trying to do that. But at the same time, I think that the debate breaks down because at a certain point, people understand there's no reason really behind it. It's really just a matter of I want to do what I want to do.
Absolutely.
And so then we redefine America into a place where we do what we want to do.
Right. Yeah. It's like one of the great clips from Parks and Rec is when Ron Swanson is in a park and he's trying to do, I don't remember I think he's cooking something I think he was cooking food, and the ranger comes up to him and asks him for a permit, and he goes, "Oh, I have a permit," and he hands it to him, and it just says, "I can do what I want." Right now, I love that because he's
a
pushing,
great character.
He is, and it's pushing back against big government, and I know that whatever that guy's name is that plays Ron Swanson is actually a huge liberal and did it as a parody, but it really embodies some great values that at least a younger version of me identifies with very well. But at the same time,
everyone can relate to that.
Yeah, nobody wants big government telling them what to do, and so point there is though that desire to do what we want is a misunderstanding of doing what we ought, right? And we were talking about it before we started recording. I think it was John Adams who said that our form of government is really only functional if you have a moral society, and it's absolutely incompatible, thank you, with any other form of society or any other form of people and of life. So we look at our American experiment and we ask, well, why are we trillions of dollars in debt? Why is our poverty line why is the number of people in poverty increasing in certain areas and not decreasing across the board? We ask, why are we continually in all of these foreign conflicts that seem to have no end? And we look at all of these problems. We look at, the lowest tax rate now, you're paying close to 10%, right? Like, why are we as broken of a society as we are? Why don't we have a healthcare system that functions? Why don't we have all of these things? And it's because we've lost that moral fabric that ties society together, right? Like you said earlier, there's plenty of things that the church should be doing that the government is now doing, and that the government now no longer allows the church to do, right? So like if you wanted to open a soup kitchen at your church, there's a lot of red tape that you have to go through. You have to get signed off by Department of Public Health. You got to get all of this stuff in line. You got to pay for licenses and all of this, and you got to get checks. You can't just serve people anymore, right? And it's because the government doesn't like competition. And that's the old Ron Paul thing, right? Don't steal, the government hates competition. So at the point there is, I think there needs to be a reining in of that government ethic of we're here to help, and a reclamation of the church ethic of we're here for the good of society, right?
Right. And the more paternal the state becomes, the more people are formed as children in their mindset, and the way we live and act, and the expectations we have for ourselves and for our life. So much of this is reclaiming the idea of, we're given freedom so that we might exercise it well. And what does that look like? It looks like people growing into the fullness of maturity. There's so much beauty in that. And a lot of this goes back to, just pausing to consider for a moment that God chose to create us as beings that start off as infants. And we don't even remember the earliest days. And we're so completely dependent and helpless in the earliest days. But we grow and develop and mature, and we learn along the way so that we can then love and cultivate and serve and nurture those that come along after us. And then we pass it forward. The whole thing is an exercise in dying to self.
Right.
It's an exercise in learning to love others and serve others and understand that we are not the center of the universe. We're not the hero of the story.
Right. Which is interesting because I think a lot of times that's seen as a uniquely American point of view, right? This independence, this do what we want, this unconnection from my neighbor and society. But if we look historically, it's really a tremendous change, right? When de Tocqueville came to the U.S., he said that dependence of a society and culture and the ties that bind us together were what made America distinct and exceptional, right? But we've used this overarching idea of freedom that America was founded on to actually go in the opposite direction, to say that I don't need to care about my neighbor. I'm not my brother's keeper, right?
Right. And I remember us touching on this in an earlier session, but it really is how we view freedom. Is freedom an end or a means?
Right.
And maybe, a lot of these places in the conversation where we're talking about values and big theoretical things and the way to apply them in life, I think a lot of these disconnects between people, people of a lot of shared ground and shared values and good intentions, we disconnect when we're not on the same page about what is the end goal and what is a means of getting there. I remember this was a huge light bulb moment for me growing as a Christian and kind of coming from a very, very libertarian background. The moment I realized that freedom cannot hold up to the pressure of being the ultimate good. Now, it made sense to me from a kind of secular standpoint. Look, you got a pluralistic society. There's not much that everyone's going to agree on, but we can all agree on.
Yeah,
we all want to be free. We all want to have individual liberty. That, so far as the state is concerned, that is the ultimate good.
Right.
And let's just be done with it there. The problem is, it's you try to put anything in the God seat that is not God, and it gets pulverized by that pressure. It just can't withstand it. It can't hold up to everything you're expecting it to do. The conversation, immediately begs the question, well, how do we define freedom? What are these individual liberties? Are they real or did we invent them? If we invented them, who invented them? Because whoever invented them gets to change them or redefine them. Right? So is it the majority? We get to just vote and redefine what the personal liberties are?
Yes.
Is it, no, it's self-evident, rationally discovered principles that are baked into nature and therefore they're beyond the grasp of the majority. Well, so you're talking about a law of nature that's placed there by its creator. So now we're talking about God again. But which version of God are you going to be basing this understanding on? And if you're like, no, it's a secular, humanistic, rationalistic kind of approach to human nature. It's like, well, have you even begun to delve into philosophy? And you got thousands of guys that are way smarter than we'll ever be. And they didn't all look at nature and come to the same conclusions.
Right.
It's like, it's self-evident. You just start looking at rocks and trees and plants and duh. Law of nature, individual liberties. No. You kind of need a larger concept of creation as inherently meaningful because it was made with purpose, and therefore everything in it has purpose.
Absolutely.
But what is that purpose?
Yeah.
Every religion has a different answer to that.
Right. And that's part of why democracy is not exportable, right?
Yeah.
That's why we failed in planting democracy in Afghanistan, why we failed in planting democracy in Iraq, why we failed in South Vietnam. Like, there's just consistently there's a huge disconnect between the moral implications of our founding and the outpouring of it. I think one of the, going back to kind of a classic Americana thing, the Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms. Yes, the car alarm is just a nice bonus for everyone. Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms, right? It's freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear, right? And those are great aspirational things. But the way we get there...
It's what every father should want for his family.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And there's no coincidence that you get that expression of the American mind in Rockwell in the midst of the Depression era.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. And then the question is, how do we get there? What is our means to those ends? And if you're on the right or the left, those means are going to be very different, right? And one side, the right, would actually produce those means, and the other side will not produce those means, or will not produce those ends. So it's not just an agreement on the end game, which is important, and there is ways to work together in a bipartisan way to get there. But oftentimes, the means to those ends is just as important, right? The process matters. Process is huge, and that's one of the reasons why Washington right now is so broken, because there's no agreed upon process, right? If the Senate can't get something done, then they're going to invoke the nuclear option and make it a simple majority, right? Which is a total misunderstanding of the rules and why those things were put in place by the people that wrote them 100 years ago, 150 years ago. So I think we've lost that idea of process in our desire for those ends. And everybody is equally to blame for that, I think. Just about.
It's so easy to become very short-sighted.
Mm-hmm.
And we think about the immediate gain, the immediate victory. We forsake long-term processes. You know, in so many ways, what I love, I think the genius of Christian thought, which just reflects its truth and its resonance with nature and who we are, is the way in which it's so balanced.
Very much so, yeah. Absolutely.
You know, ends and means, processes, ends. Like what is the Christian life? It is a process.
Mm-hmm.
Because we know this isn't about building a utopia here and now.
Right.
Now, I would love for my household to look like a little picture of the kingdom of God.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, that sounds utopian in a sense, but part of my whole understanding of the world as a Christian is that my life at this stage is regularly pursuing Christ because we are still in this age on, you know, the short side, on the near side of eternity.
Right.
And
it's aspirational.
Actively learning what it is to walk with Christ and to die to self because I'm still dealing with the curse of sin and death.
Right.
Even though I know that he has set me free from that, eternally speaking, I'm still living in this fallen world in the current age, which is still awaiting the second coming, the reuniting of heaven and earth, the recreation.
Right.
And so, there, you know, in that way, it's so balanced, right? Because you get to pursue, you know, on earth as it is in heaven as a Christian, and you ought to work for that without buying into utopian delusions. When we're caught by surprise that utopia is not possible because you start off with a false ideology and a bad anthropology of what human beings are, you get very frustrated. And this is why dictators with utopian visions, they can attract a large following, and then those people will cheer as the dictator does whatever it takes to bring their promises into fruition, right?
Right.
Especially when it's like, hey, you know what? The only reason we haven't achieved utopia yet is because of those people. Let's wipe them out.
Right. Yes.
It's their fault.
Which is what's right, and that's what Solzhenitsyn talks about. Is he's like, if only there were bad people somewhere that we could go and get rid of and take out and make the world a perfect place, right? But he says that line of good and evil goes right down the center of every man's heart. And
exactly.
Yep. And there's no And this is why I
And
think
our life is defined by reckoning and wrestling
Yes.
with that every day. So it is a process.
Right.
And the process matters.
Yes.
And that is the best way to approach liberty.
right. And I think process is the end goal for the Christian, right? Because, in Georgia recently, last year, I think it's maybe a year and a half ago now, 2 years ago, we passed the heartbeat bill. And this was a huge pro-life win. And it is phenomenal. I'm very, very happy that we got there and we got that done. Now, at the same time, at some point that will be repealed. Like at some point we will lose ground on that issue. And the Christians need to not be deterred by that, right? Your end goal is not the kingdom of God on earth. Your end goal is to pursue the kingdom as much as you can, right? And so in that process, it is glorifying to the Lord. It is a good thing. It is good for you. It's good for society.
We just serve.
Absolutely.
Wherever we are.
Yep.
Wherever the battle's at.
Consistently.
Think about the GIs fighting their way across France.
Mm-hmm.
Every step of the way, we're losing lives. Every inch of France is covered with American blood, right? And the closer we get to the Rhine, and then the closer you get to Berlin, all you can ever do is fight for the next obstacle,
right?
Fight for the next position.
And that's a great example because our forefathers accomplished that, right? They took out Nazi Germany. They brought peace and stability again to Europe. Well, and then what? Within 5 years, I guess it would be probably more like 15 years. Churchill comes to Missouri and says an Iron Curtain has descended across Europe, right? Mm-hmm. So you one dictator and one authoritarian regime is gone, and another has risen up in its place.
Yeah.
And it's this consistent battle that we have for the good, the true, and the beautiful.
And we can also take hope and encouragement from the fact that at the end of the day, we know it's Christ who's going to be the one to actually, walk into Berlin, to extend that metaphor,
sure,
and actually take out Hitler's bunker.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking in these terms because it's Memorial Day, and I was listening to all these veterans' testimonies, and just remembering what the day was about. But we know that the ultimate victory is going to come through Christ,
right?
And it's not solely dependent on us, which actually means a lot of that pressure and weight is taken off of us, mm-hmm. which also means we're not driven by desperation. And it's the desperation that causes a dictator to say, we're going to just have to start, chopping off heads here to make this work.
Mm-hmm.
Or even, if people of faith lose sight of that and start acting in desperation, that's when they become very legalistic. They forego healthy processes. They forego a long-term vision and approach because you start acting like it's all about right here, right now, when it's not.
Mm-hmm.
We know that all of this is ultimately going to be restored. It's already been redeemed.
Right.
And it will be restored. There's no stopping that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Which is incredibly encouraging, right? And it's easy to lose sight of that when you're in these processes, and you lose ground or you don't gain the ground that you expected to gain. But it like you said, it all goes back to the fact that the process is also a huge part of bringing glory to the Lord. That faithfulness, that continual striving for what we know is right and what He wants us to do and to become and to achieve is really important, even if you never achieve it, right?
Yeah.
Even if you never achieve it.
Yeah. So I guess to circle it all up, I always think back to that idea of that golden triangle between faith and freedom and virtue.
Yes.
Because we don't want to make the mistake of treating freedom like the ultimate good in and of itself,
mm-hmm.
The golden calf that everything else bows to. It can't handle that pressure. We need to define it and understand what it is so that we can actively lean into it as a healthy process,
right,
and a way of life wherein human beings rightly mature and flourish, living into their God-given purpose. And, so the golden triangle picture is just a reminder, like, freedom is essential in that sense, which is why it's something worth fighting for and valuing. People don't mature. You think about a high schooler, right? If he doesn't have any concept of a life in which he actually learns to become independent, self-sustaining,
Right.
so that he can then become a pillar of strength to a family, right? And one who can look out for the next generation behind him. If you don't live into that fully and freely and learn to be that for the next generation, it is it's a lesser picture of what human beings are capable of and called to be, right? And so, and family is just an easy picture of that with the multi-generational aspect of it. But this is so much bigger than flesh and blood. In fact, it's really important to remember it's not just about flesh and blood.
Right.
It's about actually learning what it is to serve our fellow man because they're made in the image of God, to actually seek the salvation of the lost because Christ loves them and died for them, to actually look out for the widows and the orphans all around us. It's what James calls true religion.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it binds us together as human beings. If we lose that, and we're prone to it constantly because we live in a radically individualistic context, we can never think that true religion is, I look out for myself, I keep my nose clean.
Right, yes.
And the rest of this can burn. No, it's having the heart of Christ, the heart that would humble itself and go into the midst of the darkness in order to bring the light. And you can't be surprised if that, that's not an easy or suffering-free walk. But that's, again, it goes back to choosing where we suffer and where we serve.
Right.
And choosing to do it in the way that is most meaningful and most sanctifying to us, most redeeming for the world, most glorifying to God.
Yeah. That's really good. Man, I don't know that there's much to add on top of that. I think that's a really good wrap-up for this series. I really enjoyed it. I think I've learned a lot in the conversation. Hopefully, if you're listening, you've done the same. Not sure how long our hiatus will be before our next season starts, but
what's even left to talk about? We solved all the world's problems.
Yes, all solved in these 10 episodes, if my math is correct. But we really appreciate you listening. We appreciate you joining us for this. If you have any thoughts, any questions, any concerns, please feel free to reach out to us. We're on Facebook. That'd be the best way to do it. Or individually as well.
Well, thanks for doing this, Bryce.
Yeah, thanks for
It's
joining.
been a joy and a privilege to have these conversations with you. And if anything comes out of this, I hope it's, we're able to just be an effective blinking neon light, pointing people to a greater hope and a greater truth that is beyond us and beyond anything in this world, but is absolutely real nonetheless. And it makes everything that happens in this world so much more meaningful and allows us to live with hope every day. The fight is worth it. Even our suffering is redeemed in Christ, who's right there with us in the trenches every step of the way.
Amen.
Thanks for doing this, Bryce.
Yeah. Hey everybody, this is Bryce Futch, host and creator of the Way Forward podcast, and I wanted to take a minute and tell you about our sponsor for Season 2, Stand for Georgia Values Political Action Committee. They exist to ensure that every vote in Georgia is an informed vote, providing clear, concise, and accurate information about the issues and candidates shaping our future. They do some incredible work finding phenomenal candidates at a local level throughout North Georgia, and then also doing some work across the state as well. But you can find out more information about them at standforgeorgiavaluespac.com. We're incredibly grateful to have them as a sponsor. Like I said, not only have they sponsored Season 2, but they're going to continue to sponsor the podcast moving forward. So hopefully you'll be getting some more regular content from us. Be on the lookout for that next month. We're very excited for what is to come on the way forward. Full disclosure, I do serve as their executive director of that organization and their partnered 501c3 Stand for Georgia Values Foundation. But thanks again to Stand for Georgia Values PAC for their sponsorship. Please check out their website and be involved with them so that they can continue to support the work that we do here at The Way Forward. Thanks for listening.